The monsoon rains came early to Burma in 1944, turning the jungle into a steaming, suffocating hell where the line between earth and water disappeared, where everything rotted and festered, where disease killed as efficiently as bullets. In the dense forests along the Irrawaddy River, where British and American forces were fighting to push the Japanese back toward Thailand, the rain fell in sheets so thick it was like standing under a waterfall, and the mud was so deep that soldiers sank to their knees with every step. In a makeshift field hospital hidden beneath the jungle canopy, a young woman worked by the light of kerosene lamps, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she cleaned and bandaged wounds, administered morphine, held the hands of dying men who called out for mothers and wives they would never see again. Her name was Eleanor Chun, and in the spring of 1944, she was 31 years old, a British-Chinese chemist who had volunteered as a field nurse when the war came to Burma, and someone who carried secrets that could get her executed if the Japanese ever captured her. Eleanor was small and slight, barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, with the delicate features and porcelain skin that came from her Chinese mother's side of the family, and the green eyes and light brown hair that came from her British father. She had been born in Rangoon to a family that embodied the complex colonial relationships of British Burma. Her father was a civil engineer who had come to Burma to build railways and bridges for the British Empire, and her mother was the daughter of a wealthy Chinese merchant family that had been in Burma for 3 generations. Eleanor had grown up speaking English, Burmese, and Cantonese, had been educated at British schools in Rangoon, and later at Cambridge University, where she had studied chemistry and graduated with honors in 1935. She had returned to Rangoon planning to work in her family's import-export business, but she had found herself drawn instead to research, to the laboratory, to the precise and logical world of chemical reactions and molecular structures. She had taken position at Rangoon University, teaching chemistry and conducting research on industrial applications of chemical compounds. It was work she loved, work that made her feel like she was contributing something meaningful, work that used her mind in ways that felt satisfying and important. But in December 1941, everything changed. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, invaded Malaya and the Philippines, and within weeks were pushing into Burma. The British colonial government, unprepared and overwhelmed, began a chaotic retreat toward India. Eleanor's family fled Rangoon along with thousands of other refugees, making the brutal journey through the jungle and mountains to India, a journey that killed her mother from dysentery and her father from exhaustion and heartbreak. Eleanor survived, arriving in India traumatized and alone, and she immediately volunteered for war service. The British military, desperate for anyone with medical or scientific training, accepted her as a field nurse despite her lack of formal medical education. They gave her a crash course in battlefield medicine, issued her a uniform, and sent her back into Burma with a British Indian unit that was part of the Allied effort to retake the country from Japanese occupation. But Eleanor's role was more complex than that of a simple field nurse. Before she had left India, she had been approached by officers from the Special Operations Executive, the British Intelligence and Sabotage Organization. They had reviewed her file, had seen her chemistry degree from Cambridge, her research experience, her language skills, and they had made her an offer. They needed someone who could work behind enemy lines, someone who could blend in, someone who had scientific knowledge that could be weaponized. They wanted her to be more than a nurse. They wanted her to be a saboteur, an assassin, a weapon. Eleanor had accepted, driven by rage at what the Japanese had done to her family and her country, driven by a desire for revenge that burned hotter than any fever. The SOE had given her additional training, had taught her about explosives and poisons, about sabotage techniques and covert operations, and they had given her access to something that was supposed to be forbidden, something that violated international law, something that could change the course of battles, chemical weapons. The British and Americans had stockpiles of chemical weapons in the Pacific Theater, including mustard gas, phosgene, and other lethal compounds. Official policy was never to use them unless the Japanese used them first, but the SOE operated in moral gray areas, and they believed that unconventional weapons might be necessary to defeat an enemy as fanatical and brutal as the Japanese. They had trained Eleanor in the handling and deployment of chemical agents, had taught her how to improvise chemical weapons from available materials, had turned her scientific knowledge into a tool for killing, and they had sent her into the jungle with instructions to use whatever methods were necessary to disrupt Japanese operations, to kill Japanese soldiers, to create chaos and fear behind enemy lines. Eleanor carried these instructions like a weight on her soul, knowing that what she was being asked to do violated every principle of civilized warfare, knowing that if she was captured, she would be tortured and executed, knowing that even if she survived the war, she would carry the moral burden of what she had done for the rest of her life. If you've ever been called delicate, if you've ever been underestimated because of your size or your gender or your appearance, if you've ever been dismissed as too fragile or too gentle to do what needs to be done, then subscribe right now. Because this is the story of a woman who was called delicate her entire life, who was told she belonged in a laboratory or a classroom, not on a battlefield, who then proceeded to become one of the most effective and terrifying saboteurs in the Burma campaign. Stay until the end, because what she did challenged every assumption about women in war, about the limits of moral compromise, and about the terrible things that ordinary people can do when they're pushed to the edge. The field hospital where Eleanor worked was located in a clearing deep in the jungle, about 15 miles behind the front lines. It consisted of a dozen large tents, a surgical theater set up in a bamboo structure with a corrugated metal roof, and living quarters for the medical staff and the walking wounded who were recovering enough to be evacuated. The hospital treated casualties from several British and Indian units that were fighting to push the Japanese back along the Irrawaddy River, and it was constantly overwhelmed, constantly short of supplies, constantly dealing with more wounded than it could handle. Eleanor worked 18-hour shifts, moving from patient to patient, doing triage, assisting in surgeries, providing comfort to men who were dying. She saw the wounds that modern warfare inflicted. Limbs blown off by artillery, abdominal wounds from rifle fire, burns from flamethrowers, infections from the jungle environment that turned minor wounds into life-threatening conditions. She saw young men, British and Indian soldiers barely out of their teens, crying for their mothers as they died. She saw the psychological casualties, men who had broken under the stress of combat, who sat staring at nothing, who screamed in their sleep, who could no longer function as soldiers. And she saw the particular brutality of the war against Japan. The Japanese didn't take prisoners if they could avoid it, and they tortured and executed any Allied soldiers they captured. The British and Indian troops fought with a desperation born of knowing that surrender meant death, and the Japanese fought with fanaticism that made them willing to die rather than retreat. It was a war without mercy, without quarter, and it brutalized everyone who participated in it. Eleanor's colleagues at the hospital knew her as a dedicated and skilled nurse, someone who remained calm under pressure, who could be trusted with the most difficult cases. They called her Ellie, and they treated her with a mixture of respect and protective affection. She was small and delicate-looking, and the male doctors and orderlies felt instinctively that she needed to be protected, that she was too fragile for the harsh realities of battlefield medicine. They didn't know about her other role, about the missions she went on when she wasn't working at the hospital, about the things she did in the darkness of the jungle night. Once or twice a week, Eleanor would receive a coded message from SOE headquarters, delivered by a liaison officer who would arrive at the hospital on some pretext. The message would give her a target: a Japanese supply depot, a communication station, an officer's quarters, a patrol route, and Eleanor would prepare, gathering the materials she needed, planning her approach, steeling herself for what she was about to do. She would leave the hospital after dark, telling her colleagues she was going to check on a forward aid station or deliver medical supplies to a unit at the front. She would change out of her nurse's uniform into dark clothing, would arm herself with a pistol and a knife, would pack her chemical compounds and delivery devices, and she would move through the jungle like a ghost, using the skills the SOE had taught her, using her small size and her ability to move silently, using the darkness and the rain and the dense vegetation as cover. Her targets were usually small, isolated Japanese positions: a machine gun nest, a mortar position, a supply cache, a command post. She would approach carefully, would observe the Japanese soldiers, would wait for the right moment, and then she would deploy her weapon of choice: improvised chemical agents that she had synthesized from available materials, using her chemistry knowledge and the training the SOE had given her. Sometimes it was chlorine gas, produced by mixing bleach and acid, delivered through a crude dispersal device that she would place upwind of the Japanese position. Sometimes it was phosgene, synthesized from carbon monoxide and chlorine, more lethal and more insidious. Sometimes it was mustard gas, obtained from British stockpiles and deployed using modified grenades or artillery shells. The effects were always horrific. Soldiers choking and gasping, their lungs burning, their eyes blinded, their skin blistering. Death came slowly and agonizingly, and Eleanor would watch from a distance, would force herself to witness what she had done, would carry the images with her back to the hospital, where she would resume her role as a healer. The moral contradiction of her dual role was not lost on Eleanor. By day, she saved lives, used her knowledge and skills to heal and comfort. By night, she took lives, used the same knowledge and skills to kill in the most painful and terrifying ways possible. She struggled with this contradiction, questioned whether what she was doing was justified, whether the ends could possibly justify the means. But she always came back to the same conclusion. The Japanese had to be stopped, and conventional warfare wasn't enough. They were too fanatical, too willing to fight to the death, too brutal in their treatment of prisoners and civilians. Chemical weapons were terrible, but they were effective, and they created a psychological impact that went beyond the immediate casualties. The Japanese soldiers began to fear the jungle at night, began to fear the invisible death that could come without warning, that could wipe out an entire position in minutes. They started wearing gas masks constantly, started posting extra sentries, started avoiding certain areas where chemical attacks had occurred. The fear and paranoia that Eleanor's attacks created had a strategic value that went beyond the number of soldiers she killed. She was disrupting Japanese operations, forcing them to divert resources to defense, creating an atmosphere of terror that undermined morale. But the psychological cost to Eleanor was enormous. She had nightmares about the men she had killed, about their faces as they died, about the sounds they made as the gas burned their lungs. She woke up gasping, feeling like she couldn't breathe, feeling like she was drowning in guilt and horror. She started drinking to help her sleep, started taking risks that she knew were dangerous, started wondering if she wanted to survive the war or if part of her hoped that she would be killed, that she would be punished for what she had done. Her colleagues at the hospital noticed the changes in her. She became quieter, more withdrawn, more prone to sudden mood swings. She would snap at people for minor infractions, then apologize profusely. She would work herself to exhaustion, then disappear for days on her mysterious missions. The doctors worried about her, tried to get her to take leave, to rest, to talk about what was bothering her. But Eleanor couldn't talk about it, couldn't share the burden she carried, couldn't admit what she was doing. The turning point came in July 1944, during the monsoon season, when the fighting had slowed to a grinding stalemate. The Japanese had dug along a ridge overlooking the Irrawaddy River, creating a network of trenches and bunkers that was proving impossible to dislodge. British and Indian troops had launched several assaults, and each time they had been driven back with heavy casualties. The Japanese position was too strong, too well defended, and conventional attacks were simply feeding men into a meat grinder. Eleanor received orders from SOE headquarters. She was to conduct a large-scale chemical attack on the Japanese trench system, using mustard gas and phosgene to kill or incapacitate as many Japanese soldiers as possible, creating an opportunity for a British assault that would finally break through the Japanese lines. It was the biggest operation she had been asked to conduct, and it would require more chemical agents than she had ever used before, more careful planning, more risk. She spent a week preparing, gathering supplies, synthesizing additional chemical compounds, planning the attack. She studied maps of the Japanese positions, talked to scouts who had observed the trenches, calculated wind patterns and dispersal rates. She requisitioned gas cylinders from British stockpiles, modified them for her purposes, arranged for them to be transported to a forward position near the Japanese lines. The night of the attack, Eleanor moved into position with a small team of SOE operatives who had been assigned to assist her. They carried the gas cylinders to the jungle, moving slowly and carefully, avoiding Japanese patrols. They reached a position about 200 yards from the Japanese trenches, on high ground that would allow the gas to flow downward into the enemy positions. They set up the cylinders, connected the dispersal tubes, checked and rechecked everything. Eleanor looked at the Japanese trenches through binoculars, could see the soldiers moving around, could see the glow of cigarettes, could hear voices and laughter. These were human beings, Men with families and hopes and dreams. Men who had been conscripted into a war they might not have wanted. Men who were following orders just like she was. And she was about to kill them in one of the most horrible ways imaginable. She hesitated, her hand on the valve that would release the gas. She thought about her parents, about the refugees who had died fleeing Rangoon, about the British and Indian soldiers she had treated at the hospital, about all the suffering and death that this war had caused. She thought about the moral weight of what she was about to do, about whether she would be able to live with herself afterward, about whether there was any justification for this kind of killing. And then she opened the valve. The gas flowed out of the cylinders, invisible in the darkness, heavier than air, flowing downward into the Japanese trenches like water. Eleanor and her team opened all the cylinders, releasing hundreds of pounds of mustard gas and phosgene into the night air. The wind was perfect, blowing steadily toward the Japanese positions, carrying the gas directly into the trench system. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The gas was odorless and invisible, and the Japanese soldiers didn't know they were being poisoned. Then the screaming started. It began with a few voices, confused and frightened, then spread rapidly as more and more soldiers realized something was wrong. Men started coughing, gasping for air, crying out in pain as the gas burned their lungs and eyes and skin. The screaming grew louder, more desperate, more agonized. Soldiers stumbled out of the trenches, clawing at their faces, tried to escape the invisible death that was killing them. Eleanor watched through her binoculars, forcing herself to witness what she had done. She saw men falling, convulsing, dying. She saw others try and help their comrades, only to be overcome by the gas themselves. She saw the chaos and terror, the complete breakdown of military discipline, the transformation of an organized offensive position into a scene of pure horror. The attack lasted about 20 minutes, until the gas had dispersed and the wind had carried it away. When it was over, the Japanese trenches were silent, except for the moaning of the wounded and dying. Eleanor estimated that she had killed or incapacitated at least 200 Japanese soldiers, maybe more. It was the most effective single attack she had conducted, and it was also the most horrifying. She and her team withdrew, moving back through the jungle to the British lines. At dawn, British and Indian troops launched their assault on the Japanese positions, and they encountered almost no resistance. The few Japanese soldiers who had survived the gas attack were too sick or too traumatized to fight effectively. The British took the ridge with minimal casualties, breaking through the Japanese defensive line and opening the way for a further advance. Eleanor returned to the field hospital and went back to work, treating wounded soldiers, saving lives. But she was changed by what she had done, by the scale of the killing, by the sound of those men screaming as they died. She had crossed a line that she couldn't uncross, had done something that she knew was morally indefensible even if it was strategically justified. In the days and weeks that followed, Eleanor continued her work at the hospital, but she stopped conducting sabotage missions. She told her SOE handlers that she was done, that she couldn't do it anymore, that the psychological cost was too high. They tried to pressure her, told her she was needed, that her work was saving Allied lives. But Eleanor was adamant. She had killed enough people. She had done enough terrible things. She was finished. The war in Burma continued for another year, with the British and Indian forces gradually pushing the Japanese back toward Thailand. Eleanor remained with the field hospital, treating casualties, doing the work of a nurse. She never spoke about her role as a saboteur, never told her colleagues what she had done. It was her secret, her burden, and she carried it alone. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Eleanor was in Rangoon, which had been liberated by British forces in May. The city was in ruins, devastated by years of occupation and the fighting that had accompanied liberation. Eleanor walked through the streets where she had grown up, seeing the destruction, the poverty, the trauma that the war had left behind. Her family's home was gone, destroyed in the fighting. The university where she had taught was damaged and closed. Everything she had known before the war was gone. She stayed in Burma for several months, helping with reconstruction efforts, working in a civilian hospital treating people who were suffering from malnutrition and disease and the lingering effects of trauma. But she found that she couldn't stay, that the memories were too painful, that she needed to leave and start over somewhere else. In early 1946, Eleanor returned to England, to a country that was also trying to recover from the war, trying to rebuild, trying to make sense of what had happened. She settled in London and took a position teaching chemistry at a girls' school, returning to work she had done before the war, trying to find some sense of normalcy and purpose. But she was haunted by what she had done in Burma. She had nightmares about the gas attack, about the screaming Japanese soldiers, about the men she had killed. She struggled with depression and guilt, with the knowledge that she had violated fundamental moral principles, that she had used her scientific knowledge to create suffering and death on a massive scale. She never married, never had children, never formed close relationships. She kept people at a distance, afraid that if they knew what she had done, they would see her as a monster. She threw herself into her teaching, into her work with her students, trying to find redemption through education, through passing on knowledge that could be used for good rather than evil. It wasn't until the 1960s that Eleanor's story began to emerge. A historian researching SOE operations in Burma came across classified documents that mention her missions, her use of chemical weapons, her role in attack on the Japanese trenches. The historian contacted Eleanor, now in her 50s, and asked if she would be willing to talk about her experiences. Eleanor was initially reluctant, afraid of how people would judge her, afraid of being seen as a war criminal rather than a war hero. But the historian was persistent, and eventually Eleanor agreed to tell her story, partly because she felt that the truth should be known, partly because she hoped that talking about it might help her find some peace. The historian's book, published in 1967, caused a sensation. Eleanor's story challenged every assumption about women in war, about the limits of acceptable warfare, about the moral compromises that people make in extreme circumstances. Some people celebrated her as a hero, as someone who had done what was necessary to defeat a brutal enemy. Others condemned her as a war criminal, as someone who had violated international law and basic human decency. Eleanor herself refused to accept either characterization. In interviews, she was clear about what she had done and why she had done it. But she also acknowledged the moral weight of her actions. "I killed people in terrible ways," she said in one interview. "I used chemical weapons, which are banned by international law for good reason. I did it because I believed it was necessary, because I wanted to stop the Japanese, because I wanted revenge for what they had done to my family and my country. But that doesn't make it right. It doesn't absolve me of responsibility for what I did." She continued, "People want to make me into either a hero or a villain, but I'm neither. I'm someone who was put in an impossible situation and made choices that I'm not proud of. I did what I thought I had to do, but I've lived with the consequences every day since. The men I killed haunt me. Their screams haunt me. And I don't think I'll ever find peace with what I did." Eleanor's story sparked a broader debate about chemical warfare, about the ethics of unconventional weapons, about what is acceptable in war. The British government, embarrassed by the revelation that they had used chemical weapons in Burma despite official policy against it, initially tried to deny the story, then admitted it, but claimed it was an isolated incident conducted by rogue operatives. Documents declassified in later years revealed that the use of chemical weapons in Burma was more widespread than the government had admitted, and that Eleanor was one of several operatives who had been trained and equipped for chemical warfare operations. The debate about Eleanor's actions continues to this day. Was she a hero who did what was necessary to defeat a brutal enemy? Was she a war criminal who violated international law and basic human decency? Or was she something more complex, a person who made terrible choices in terrible circumstances, who carried the moral weight of those choices for the rest of her life? Eleanor herself never claimed to be a hero. She saw herself as someone who had been broken by war, who had done things that she could never fully justify or forgive herself for. She spent the rest of her life trying to make amends, trying to use her knowledge and skills for good, trying to find some way to balance the scales. She became an advocate for arms control, speaking out against chemical and biological weapons, arguing that they should be banned completely and that the international community should enforce those bans rigorously. She testified before parliamentary committees, wrote articles for academic journals, gave lectures at universities. She used her own story as a cautionary tale, as an example of what happens when moral boundaries are crossed, when the ends are used to justify any means. "They called me delicate," she said in a speech at Cambridge University in 1975. They looked at me and saw a small, fragile woman who belonged in a laboratory or a classroom, not on a battlefield. And they were right in a way. I didn't belong on a battlefield. No one belongs on a battlefield. War brings out the worst in people, makes them do things they never thought they were capable of, things that violate their deepest values and beliefs. She continued, but I also want you to understand that being delicate, being small, being a woman, doesn't mean you can't be effective, can't be dangerous, can't accomplish things that people think are impossible. I prove that. I use my scientific knowledge, my intelligence, my determination to become one of the most effective saboteurs in the Burma campaign. I killed hundreds of enemy soldiers. I changed the course of battles. I did things that trained military personnel would have struggled to achieve. But I also want you to understand the cost. The cost of the people I killed who died in agony, who suffered terribly. The cost of me, who has lived with guilt and nightmares and moral anguish for 30 years. The cost of society, when we normalize the use of weapons that cause unnecessary suffering, that violate basic principles of humanity. The cost is too high. It's always too high. Eleanor died in 1989 at the age of 76. Her funeral was small and private, attended by a few former students and colleagues. She was buried in a cemetery in North London, and her gravestone bore only her name and dates, with no mention of her war service, no indication of what she had done. In the years since her death, Eleanor's story has been told and retold in books and documentaries and academic papers. She has become a symbol of the moral complexity of war, of the impossible choices that people face in extreme circumstances, of the long-term psychological cost of violence. But these retellings often simplify her story, turning her into either a hero or a villain when reality was much more nuanced. Eleanor was someone who was called delicate her entire life, who was underestimated and dismissed because of her size and her gender. She proved that those assumptions were wrong, that she was capable of extraordinary things, that she could be as effective and as deadly as any soldier. But she also showed us the cost of that effectiveness, the moral and psychological burden that comes with using violence, especially violence that crosses moral boundaries. The title, The Woman Who Flooded Japanese Trenches with Poison Gas, is accurate, but it's also incomplete. Eleanor was a chemist, a teacher, a nurse, a saboteur, an advocate, a person who struggled with guilt and trauma for her entire adult life. She was someone who made terrible choices in terrible circumstances, who accomplished something extraordinary, and who then spent the rest of her life trying to make sense of what she had done and what it meant. When they called her delicate, they meant it as a limitation, as a reason why she couldn't do certain things, couldn't handle certain situations. But Eleanor turned that perceived weakness into a strength, used it as camouflage, as a way to move through the world without being seen as a threat. And then she used her scientific knowledge, her intelligence, her determination, to become a weapon more effective than most soldiers. The gas attack on the Japanese trenches was a remarkable and horrifying achievement. A civilian chemist, working with minimal resources and support, had successfully conducted a large-scale chemical warfare operation that killed hundreds of enemy soldiers and broke through a defensive line that had resisted conventional attacks for weeks. It was the kind of operation that military chemical warfare units would plan for months, that would require extensive training and specialized equipment. Eleanor did it with improvised materials, determination, and scientific knowledge. But the achievement came at a cost that Eleanor never stopped paying. She lived with the knowledge that she had killed hundreds of men in one of the most painful and terrifying ways possible, that she had violated international law and basic human decency, that she had used her scientific knowledge to create suffering on a massive scale. She didn't regret the strategic outcome, but she carried the moral weight of the means she had used to achieve it. Her story challenges us to think about war in more complex ways, to understand that heroism and atrocity are not always clearly separated, that the people who fight wars often do terrible things for what they believe are good reasons, and that the moral accounting of those actions is never simple or straightforward. It challenges us to recognize that women are capable of the same violence as men, that gender doesn't determine capacity for brutality, that assumptions about delicacy and fragility are often wrong. And it challenges us to honor not just the achievement of people like Eleanor, but also their struggles, their doubts, their moral complexity. She was effective, but she was also traumatized. She was brave, but she was also haunted. She accomplished something extraordinary, but she paid a terrible price for it. They called her delicate, thinking that would define her limits, that would determine what she could and couldn't do. Instead, it became a mask she wore, a disguise that allowed her to move through the world unnoticed, underestimated, dismissed. And behind that mask was someone who was capable of extraordinary violence, who could kill with scientific precision, who could flood trenches with poison gas and watch men die in agony. Eleanor Chin was called delicate, but she became deadly. She was underestimated, but she proved everyone wrong. She was told she didn't belong on a battlefield, but she changed the course of battles. And she did it all while carrying a moral burden that would have crushed most people, while struggling with guilt and trauma, while trying to maintain some sense of humanity in the midst of inhuman circumstances. Her legacy is not just the battles she influenced or the soldiers she killed, but the questions she forces us to ask about war, about morality, about the limits of acceptable violence, about what we're willing to do to defeat our enemies, and what we lose in the process. She showed us that being delicate doesn't mean being weak, that being underestimated can be an advantage, that women are capable of the same violence and the same moral complexity as men. But she also showed us that violence, even necessary violence, comes at a cost that can never be fully paid, that the moral compromises we make in war stay with us forever, that there are some lines that once crossed can never be uncrossed. Eleanor Chin flooded Japanese trenches with poison gas, and in doing so, she saved Allied lives and changed the course of the Burma campaign. But she also condemned herself to a lifetime of guilt and trauma, to decades of nightmares and moral anguish, to a burden that she carried until the day she died. They called her delicate. They were wrong about what that meant, wrong about what she was capable of, wrong about the limits of her strength and determination. But they were also right, in a way, because beneath the deadly effectiveness, beneath the scientific precision, beneath the willingness to kill, Eleanor remained someone who was deeply affected by what she did, who never lost her capacity for moral reflection, who never stopped questioning whether the ends justified the means. That delicacy, that sensitivity, that refusal to become numb to the horror of what she had done, was perhaps her most defining characteristic. She was deadly, but she was never callous. She was effective, but she was never indifferent. She killed, but she never stopped being human. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of her story. That war doesn't just test our courage and our strength, but our humanity. That the real challenge is not just to survive, not just win, but to maintain some sense of moral integrity in circumstances that destroy it. Eleanor struggled with that challenge every day of her life after the war, and she never found a satisfactory answer. But she kept struggling, kept questioning, kept trying to make sense of what she had done and what it meant. And in that struggle, in that refusal to accept easy answers or simple judgments, she showed us what it really means to be human in the face of war's inhumanity.